Welcome to Somali Nexus, the podcast where we unravel the rich tapestry of the Somali people, exploring everything from ancient roots to modern realities. And in today's episode, Decoding the Somali Genetic Tapestry, we're diving into something truly fascinating: the genetic history of the Somali people, a story written not in books, but in DNA. For centuries, the origins of the Somali people have been steeped in myth and oral tradition, with stories tracing back to the Arabian Peninsula and noble Arab patriarchs. But what if the truth is far more complex and far older than we ever imagined? What if the key to understanding the Somali identity lies in the genes that have traveled through time, carrying with them stories of migration, survival, and connection? Recent advancements in genetic science have revealed a remarkable and surprising narrative, one that goes beyond popular misconceptions. The Somali genome is not just a simple mix of recent Arab or Bantu ancestry. In fact, it's an ancient Afro-Eurasian fusion, shaped by migrations that occurred thousands of years ago, long before the rise of modern civilizations. From the indigenous Cushitic-speaking ancestors to the ancient Ethio-Somali component linked to the Near East, the Somali genetic story is a living archive that holds the keys to understanding our shared human history. Today, we'll explore the depths of this genetic journey, dissecting everything from paternal Y-DNA lineages to maternal mitochondrial mtDNA, and even uncovering the surprising connections to ancient populations like the Natufians of the Levant. We'll also touch on how these ancient roots influence modern Somali health and medical science, giving us a glimpse into how genetics plays a role in everything from disease predispositions to personalized medicine. So, whether you're a history enthusiast, a science lover, or someone eager to understand more about before we dive in, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss an episode of Somali Nexus. And if you enjoyed today's journey, don't forget to like and share this video with friends. Let's spread the story of the Somali people far and wide. Now, let's get started. Welcome to the deep dive. We love cracking open fascinating topics, trying to bring you the core insights. And today we're diving into a genetic detective story. It really challenges some, deeply held historical narratives. Like lots of cultures have these powerful origin stories. The Somali people are definitely no exception there. Often oral traditions point towards fairly recent ancestral links, specifically to the Arabian Peninsula.
That's exactly right. And our mission today really is to show how cutting-edge science, we're talking population genetics here, can peel back those layers of time. It reveals a story about Somali origins that's, much more ancient and profoundly African at its core, actually. Plus, it's intricately connected to some of the very earliest chapters of human migration out of Africa.
So, just to be clear, we're not aiming to erase cultural history here.
Not at all. It's more about adding a biological framework. A really deep one that complements the cultural side. It adds another dimension, you could say.
Okay, and to do that, we're going to navigate through quite a stack of really fascinating genetic studies, research papers. We'll use their findings as our guide. Basically, we'll start with the paternal and maternal lines. What do they tell us on their own? Then we'll widen the view, look at the whole genome picture, explore some genuinely surprising deep time connections. I mean, really deep. And finally, sort of unpack what this really unique genetic profile means today for things like modern medicine, maybe even identity.
It's going to be quite a journey.
Yeah, sounds like it. So, let's dive in. Where do we start this genetic investigation?
Okay, so the best place to start is usually with what we call uniparental markers. Think of them like direct genetic messages passed down from just one parent. You've got Y-DNA, which only men inherit from their fathers, tracing the paternal line. And then mitochondrial DNA, or mtDNA, which everyone gets from their mother, tracing the maternal line.
Right, so one tracks the father's father line, the other the mother's mother line.
Exactly, and what these markers show for Somalis is, it's pretty striking.
Okay, so those traditional stories, they often point to Arabia for the paternal roots, right? What does the Y-DNA actually show when scientists trace those lines for Somali men?
Yeah, that's the common narrative, but the science, it shows something quite different. Remarkable homogeneity, actually. Study after study finds this overwhelming presence of one specific Y DNA haplogroup. It's called E1b1b, and even more specifically, a subclade called EV32. We're seeing frequencies sometimes as high as like 77.6% in Somali males.
Okay, remind us. A haplogroup is like a major branch on the human family tree, right? Trace through that single line.
Precisely, and this E1b1b branch, particularly EV32, it's not an import from somewhere else recently. It's indigenous. It belongs to Northeast Africa. Its highest genetic diversity, and diversity is usually highest near the origin point, is found right there in Ethiopia and Somalia.
Interesting. And how far back are we talking? How long has that lineage been in the Horn of Africa?
Well, genetic dating techniques suggest EV32 has been in the Horn for at least 6,000 years, minimum, so this firmly roots Somali paternal ancestry deep in the region long before modern era of identity even existed, and way before the spread of Islam.
That's a really crucial point, isn't it? It immediately starts to push back against those common narratives.
It does, and it highlights a stark contrast. Somali paternal profiles look very different from, say, West African populations. They are dominated by a related but distinct branch, E1b1a, and completely different from most Middle Eastern populations where you see lots of J1 and J2 haplogroups being dominant.
So the bottom line here is that the genetic evidence pretty much refutes any idea of a recent large-scale Arabian paternal origin for the vast majority of Somalis.
It certainly contradicts that narrative, yes, but it's worth noting there is another paternal lineage present. About 10% of Somali men carry haplogroup T, specifically T1. Now this one might have under the Horn from the Near East or Arabia, but its own origins are incredibly ancient, way before modern Arab identity formed. And what's really key is when you look at the rest of their genes, the autosomal DNA, these men carrying haplogroup T are genetically basically identical to their EV32 neighbors. That tells us this lineage wasn't a recent addition. It integrated into the Somali gene pool thousands of years ago. Deep integration.
Okay, so the paternal story is one of deep, mostly unified African roots indigenous to the Horn. What about the mother's side, the maternal lines? Is it the same picture?
No, the maternal story is definitely more complex. It shows a richer mix, hinting at different ancient movements. Research like a study by Mickelson and colleagues back in 2012 showed about 60.5% of Somali maternal lineages are indigenous sub-Saharan African ones. You know, things like L0A1D, L201H, and L3F. Pretty typical for an African population.
Okay, 60% African. But you mentioned an ancient Eurasian layer earlier. So what about the other 40%?
Right? The remaining roughly 40% belongs to what we call Eurasian macrohaplogroups, M and N. Specifically, M1 is quite common, but here's the crucial part. This M1 isn't evidence of recent contact with Eurasia, not at all. This specific M1 subclade found in the Horn has incredibly deep roots in the Horn. Some estimates suggest these M1 branches split off from others 20,000, maybe even 30,000 years ago.
30,000 years? Wow!
Yeah, it signifies a really ancient back-to-Africa migration. People moving from Eurasia back into Africa tens of thousands of years ago.
And this helps clarify.
You sometimes hear these dramatic ideas about a mysterious Southeast Asian link, because macrohaplogroup M is common there, but the specific subclades and the dating point squarely to this very ancient back migration from Western Eurasia, not Southeast Asia.
Okay, let's try and synthesize this, then unpack it a bit. The uniparental data, just looking at mother's or father's lines, shows a clear split, a dichotomy. Paternal side dominated by one single ancient indigenous Horn of Africa lineage, EV32. Maternal side, a majority of diverse indigenous African lineages, plus a big chunk 40% of ancient Eurasian lineages, mainly M1. What's the big takeaway from combining those two pictures?
Well, here's where it gets really interesting and again challenges common assumptions. This pattern, a relatively uniform paternal line from one source, and a more mixed maternal line with distinct inputs is a classic signature. It points to what geneticists call the sex-biased admixture event, something that happened deep in the past.
Sex-biased admixture, meaning more men from one group mixing with women from another, or vice versa?
Exactly. Thousands of years ago, you might have had a scenario where perhaps incoming males carrying lineages like EV32 primarily mixed with local females who carried a mix of African L types and those ancient Eurasian M and N types. Or maybe another scenario, the specific details are debated, but the pattern itself, the difference between the Y-DNA and mtDNA frequencies, strongly suggests this kind of sex-biased mixing happened deep in Somali population history.
And crucially, the age of these lineages tells us this foundational event happened thousands and thousands of years ago, long before Islam, long before the historical interactions with Arabia mentioned in clan stories.
Precisely. This isn't just a minor detail, it's fundamental. It provides a scientific explanation based on ancient events that directly contradicts the myths of recent large-scale patrilineal descent from Arab forefathers for the majority of the population.
It really does rewrite that family tree, doesn't it? At least the biological one.
It absolutely does. And moving beyond these single lines, looking at the whole picture with autosomal DNA, it confirms and deepens this story. Autosomal DNA looks at all your chromosomes, the genetic inheritance from all your ancestors, not just one direct line. It gives a much fuller picture.
Right. The total ancestry mixes. So, what does the autosomal DNA tell us about the overall breakdown for the Somali population?
Consistently across multiple genome-wide studies, the Somali population is modeled as remarkably homogeneous, very cohesive genetically, and the breakdown is roughly 60% East African ancestry and about 40% West Eurasian ancestry.
Okay, 60-40. But you said homogeneous despite having ancestry from two quite different source regions.
Yes, homogeneous in the sense that there's very little genetic variation between individuals. Most Somalis have a very similar mix in similar proportions. This points to a shared ethnogenesis, a common origin point as a distinct people followed by a long history of endogamy, meaning marrying within the group and relative genetic isolation. They mixed, formed a distinct group, and then largely kept to themselves genetically for a long time.
Now, that 40% West Eurasian component, you hinted it's not recent. Not modern European or Arab. What is it then?
This is one of the most fascinating discoveries. A landmark study in 2014 by Hodgson and colleagues identified this component. It's not just generic West Eurasian, it's a distinct, highly differentiated non-African ancestry that seems unique to the Horn of Africa. They actually termed it the Ethio-Somali component.
Ethio-Somali component. And how old is it?
Its antiquity is profound.
Yeah.
The study estimated that this ancestry branch split off from all other non-African ancestries at least 23,000 years ago.
23,000. That's incredibly ancient.
It really is. It's a cornerstone finding. And there's definitive proof separating it from more recent Arab gene flow too.
Yes, you mentioned the lactase persistence gene.
Exactly, the specific genetic mutation that allows adults to digest milk, which is common in Arabia and arose relatively recently, only about 4,000 years ago. Well, it's virtually absent in this ancient Ethio-Somali component. This clearly separates it from recent gene flow from Arabia. This Ethio-Somali component is also understood to be a primary carrier of ancestry from what we call basal Eurasians.
Basal Eurasian seems fundamental.
It is. Think of it like one of the earliest branches of the human family tree after the main migration out of Africa, a very deep early split within the Eurasian lineage. Finding so much of it preserved in the Horn of Africa connects the region directly to those very first chapters of non-African human history.
This is amazing. So, connecting the dots, you described the Somali genome as a kind of genetic time capsule. How does that help us understand the ancient Near East?
Precisely because that West Eurasian or Ethio-Somali ancestry in Somalis today is essentially a preserved remnant. It's like a snapshot of an ancient population, probably from the ancient Near East or Levant, that has since been heavily mixed or even replaced in its original homeland. The modern Near East has seen waves upon waves of subsequent migrations from Anatolia, the steppe, the air expansion, which have mixed and homogenized the genetics there.
Right, blurring the older picture.
Exactly. But because the ancestors of Somalis received this ancient component and then remained relatively isolated and endogamous, their genome preserves a huge chunk of it. That 40% in a less diluted state than you can find even in the modern Levant itself. So Somali DNA becomes this vital key. It's like finding an ancient library holding books that were lost or rewritten everywhere else. It helps us read the deep population history of the Near East.
It really is like genetic archaeology. And the plot thickens even more when we look at actual ancient DNA, doesn't it? From archaeological sites?
It absolutely does. Analyzing DNA directly from ancient human remains has been revolutionary. Take the Natufian culture, for these people lived in the Levant. Think modern-day Israel, Jordan, Syria. Roughly 15,000 to 11,500 years ago, they were fascinating. Settled down before agriculture, harvesting wild grains.
Okay, Natufians, 12,000 plus years ago in the Levant. What's their link to Somalis? Seems geographically and temporally distant.
Here's the bombshell discovery from ancient DNA analysis. Male Natufian remains found in Israel belong to Y DNA haplogroup E1b1b.
Wait, the same E1b1b macro haplogroup that's overwhelmingly dominant in Somali men today?
The very same. It provides this direct, quite stunning genetic link between the paternal ancestry, common in the Horn of Africa, and these pre-agricultural people of the Levant over 12,000 years ago. It suggests this lineage was already present in the Near East way back then. And interestingly, a later reanalysis even found a small, maybe 7% genetic component related to modern Omotic speakers of Ethiopia within those Natufians, hinting at some incredibly ancient two-way gene flow between Northeast Africa and the Levant.
Wow, that connection completely reframes things, doesn't it? It pushes the origins so much further back than recent history. So it's becoming clear that this Eurasian ancestry in the Horn isn't just one single event. It's more like layers, multiple waves of migration over millennia.
Exactly. We can sort of conceptualize it in distinct layers. Layer 1, this is the oldest, the foundational one. It's the ancient migration, likely pre-agricultural, that brought that 40% Ethio-Somali component into the Horn. This happened maybe over 7,000 years ago, perhaps much earlier. This is the defining layer for Somali genetic ancestry, bringing in key paternal lines like E1b, 1b, and T, and those ancient Eurasian paternal lines.
Okay, layer 1, the ancient foundation. Then, what's layer 2?
Layer 2 would be related to the spread of agriculture. Descendants of those Levantine farmers, perhaps related to the Natufians, moved southwards into East Africa during the Neolithic period. This migration would have likely reinforced the existing Levantine-related ancestry already present from layer 1.
Makes sense. And layer 3, you mentioned a more recent backflow?
Yes, layer 3 is what's often called the Eurasian backflow, dated to around 3,000 years ago. This was revealed quite dramatically by sequencing the genome of a man called Mota, who lived in an Ethiopian cave 4,500 years ago. His genome lacked this later layer. This backflow seems to have been a massive migratory wave from West Eurasia into the Horn, and impacting many East African populations. Its source seems related to early farmers from Anatolia and the Near East. Genetically similar perhaps to modern Sardinians, this wave contributed up to, say, 25% of the ancestry in many modern East Africans.
Okay, 3 layers. Ancient pre-agricultural Neolithic farmers spreading, and a more recent 3,000-year-old backflow. So, within this complex picture, what makes Somalis stand out genetically?
Their uniqueness comes from which layers predominantly shape them. The Somali population seems to have been primarily formed by that oldest migration, layer 1, and critically they were less impacted by the later Mota-era backflow. Layer 3, compared to many of their neighbors, especially highland Ethiopians, this relative lack of mixing from layer 3 helps explain why Somalis form such a distinct homogeneous genetic cluster today. They essentially preserved more of that ancient layer 1 signature, like a genetic island in a way.
That distinctiveness must be clear when you plot them on a genetic map of Africa and the Middle East, right? Who do they cluster closest to?
Absolutely. Genetic studies consistently show Somalis cluster most closely with other Cushitic-speaking peoples. Think of groups like the Oromo, the Afar, the Beja. This shows a really strong correlation between genetics and language family, pointing to a deep shared genetic ancestry among these Cushitic groups that probably predates the splitting of their languages.
And it's just as important for clarity to know who they are not closely related to, genetically speaking. There's this persistent kind of simplistic idea. You sometimes hear that Somalis are just a mix of Bantus and Arabs. What does the data say?
Yeah, that idea is completely unsupported, actually explicitly refuted by the genetic evidence. Somalis are genetically very distinct from Nilo-Saharan speaking groups like the Karamoja. And there's very little shared ancestry with Bantu speaking groups from further south or west in Africa. Similarly, while North African groups like Berbers also have high frequencies of E1B1B, it's different subclade mostly EM81 there versus EV32 of Somalis. And their overall autosomal ancestry mix is quite different.
Then distinct from Arabs too, despite the traditional narratives.
Yes, as we've covered, the dominant paternal lineages are different EV32 versus J1J2, primarily in Arabia, and that ancient Ethio-Somali autosomal component is clearly distinct from the Arabian genetic component. When you run genetic clustering analyses which group populations based on similarity, Somalis consistently form their own cluster close to other Cushitic groups, and they do not group together with peninsular Arabs. The genetic boundaries are quite clear.
Okay, so we have this really strong consistent genetic picture pointing to deep indigenous roots in the Horn, ancient admixture, and clear distinction effectiveness. How do we then reconcile this with those powerful oral traditions, stories many Somalis grew up with, like the Darood and Ishaq clans, tracing lineage back to specific Arab patriarchs arriving from Arabia?
That's the crux of the matter, isn't it? There's a clear contradiction between the biological evidence and these specific patrilineal origin stories. The genetic data overwhelmingly contradicts a large-scale Arab patrilineal origin for the vast majority of Somali people. The Y-DNA just doesn't support it.
So how do we understand those stories then, if not biologically true on a mass scale?
The most likely explanation, supported by historical context across the wider Islamic world, is that these are socio-political constructs claiming descent from the Prophet Muhammad's lineage. The Quraysh was historically a very common and powerful way to gain religious prestige and political legitimacy. We see historical dynasties in the Horn, like the Walashma dynasty of the Adal Sultanate, using these kinds of genealogies to bolster their right to rule.
So there are like fictive genealogies or maybe borrowed genealogies, adopted for status and legitimacy rather than reflecting mass biological migration.
Exactly. They are powerful cultural narratives deeply important for identity and social structure, but they don't seem to reflect the broad biological ancestry of the population as a whole, based on the genetic evidence we have.
And it's important to make a distinction here. Right. This doesn't mean no one in Somalia has recent Arab ancestry.
Absolutely. There are specific, often coastal groups like the Benadiri people or the Bajuni, who clearly do have documented more recent admixture from maritime trade links with Arabia, Persia, and elsewhere. But these groups are genetically distinct from the majority Somali population, whose deep ancient genetic history is what we've been focusing on.
Right. So this brings us to the really practical side of things. This isn't just about rewriting ancient history books. This unique genetic journey of the Somali people has real, tangible consequences for health today, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. Their distinct ancestral mix and long period of relative isolation means their genetic profile has unique features. And this has profound implications for modern medicine.
How so? What specific health-related aspects stand out?
Well, a major genome-wide study from 2020 looked into this. They found Somalis have quite unique characteristics in their human leukocyte antigens, the HLA system. HLA genes are critical for the immune system. They basically tell your body what's self and what's foreign. This distinct HLA setup in Somalis links to specific risk for certain diseases.
Like what, for example?
Type 1 diabetes is a major one. Studies have found exceptionally high rates of specific HLA haplotypes, known to predispose people to type 1 diabetes among Somalis. For instance, one study found the HLA-DR3-DQ2 haplotype in 75% of Somali children with the disease. Another found a specific allele DRB103:01 in 93% of them. Those are incredibly high frequencies, pointing to a strong genetic susceptibility in the population.
That's significant. Any other examples?
Yes. Studies, particularly in the diaspora in places like Minnesota, have also found a higher incidence of mutations causing adenosine deaminase deficiency, or ADA deficiency. That's another serious inherited immune disorder.
So, predisposition to certain diseases. What about how the body handles medicines?
That's another key area. The same 2020 study found that ethnic Somalis have the highest frequencies ever observed for several important pharmacogenetic variants. These are variants in genes that affect how your body metabolizes drugs. A key example mentioned was a variant called UGT1A42.
And why does that matter so much?
It matters hugely because standard drug dosages are often determined based on clinical trials done mostly on people of European or sometimes East Asian ancestry. If someone has a genetic variant like those common in Somalis that makes them metabolize a drug much faster or much slower than the average person the drug was tested on,
Then the standard dose might not work, or worse, it could be toxic.
exactly. It leads to ineffectiveness at best, or serious side effects or toxicity at worst. It's what you called a silent mismatch, a hidden biological difference between the patient's ancient genetic adaptations and modern medical practice based on other populations. It contributes to health disparities.
It really underscores the need for more diversity in medical research, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The Somali genetic story is a powerful case study for why we need to move beyond a one-size-fits-all approach in medicine, and especially in genomics. Their unique history, that specific ancient mix, the long isolation has resulted in private alleles. These are genetic variants that are common in Somalis but rare or absent elsewhere. So just lumping Somalis into broad categories like African or Middle Eastern in a medical or research context is genetically inaccurate and potentially harmful.
It makes the case very strongly for developing population-specific genomic reference database, right? For personalized medicine to actually work for everyone.
Precisely, achieving the promise of personalized medicine and reducing health disparities means we need to understand the specific genetic architectures of diverse populations. Groups like Somalis, often underrepresented in genomic studies, aren't just on the sidelines. Understanding their unique genetics is actually critical for the future of genomics and equitable healthcare.
Okay, let's try to pull all these threads together as we wrap up this deep dive. Has really deconstructed some popular myths, hasn't it? Revealing a much more complex, much more ancient Somali history.
It has. The genetics tells a pretty clear story, one that strongly refutes simple narratives of recent Arab origins for the majority. Instead, it points to this fascinating dual ancestry, a foundation of indigenous East African people who had mixed, likely in a sex-biased way, with a very ancient group related to Levantine populations maybe 23,000 plus years ago. This created that unique Ethio-Somali component.
And maybe the most scientifically surprising connection isn't to the recent Middle East, but way back to the pre-agricultural Levant. That direct genetic link, especially on the paternal side, between Somalis and the ancient Natufians, that really reframes where Somalis sit in the grand sweep of human history.
It really does. It suggests they aren't just peripheral recipients of migrations from the Near East, but that their ancestors were central players in an ancient network of Afro-Eurasian movement and interaction, potentially stretching back even before the invention of agriculture.
And the fact that Somalis today are so genetically homogeneous, that speaks volumes too, doesn't it?
It speaks to incredible resilience, a strong sense of cultural cohesion, and that history of endogamy, which together acted to preserve this unique ancient genetic for millennia. Their genome truly is like a living archive, or that time capsule we mentioned. It holds invaluable clues not just about their own origins, but about the deep history of the Near East, and maybe even the earliest divergences of non-African populations.
So, what's the final thought for you, our listener? What does this all mean? Well, maybe it means that to understand Somali genetics is to grasp a really pivotal chapter in the whole human journey. It's a story written in DNA about deep African roots, ancient Eurasian crossroads, and an identity that has endured. It highlights the incredible, often underappreciated, genetic diversity within Africa itself. And it's a powerful reminder, isn't it, that human migration wasn't a simple tree branching outwards, but more like a complex interwoven tapestry with threads moving back and forth over vast periods of time?
Absolutely. It really makes you wonder how many other deep, surprising genetic stories like this one are still hidden, waiting in the DNA of populations around the world.